I experienced a tremendous amount of rain on my big bike trip in 2017 that I certainly was not anticipating to have. Literally, I think I had 3 weeks where I didn't have a single day without some rain, if not torrential rain.
Welcome to the Seek Travel Ride podcast, where we share the stories and experiences of people who have undertaken amazing adventures by bike. Whether it's crossing state borders, mountain ranges, countries or continents, we want to share that spirit of adventuring on two wheels with our listeners. Hello, I'm your host Bella Malloy, and I'm excited to introduce my guest for today's episode of Seek Travel Ride, Jenn Hammelman. Jenn has been working at the Adventure Cycling Association for the past 25 years as a cartographer. It's fair to say, since she started there, she's seen quite a lot of changes, and she is now the Director of Routes. Now, for people planning out bicycle adventures in the USA, the Adventure Cycling Association is naturally their first port of call. Not only have they created a network of over 52,000 miles, 83,000 kilometres of routes to choose from, but the Adventure Cycling Association also has a large amount of information available to help people get on their bikes for the first time and to explore. To that end, Jenn has also done her fair share of exploring too. And in 2017, she took a trip from Portland, Maine to Seattle, Washington. The long way, cycling along routes which she worked on for years. I'm looking forward to chatting with Jenn today and getting into the details of not just that trip, but also what it's been like to be involved in an association whose very mission is to help people discover the world and experience the fullness of life through bicycle adventures. Jenn, welcome to the show.
Hi, good to meet you, Bella. I'm really excited to have this conversation today.
Oh, I'm super excited, Jenn. I think it's actually a real gift of an episode for my listeners who are probably maybe tuning in thinking about a future adventure for them across the US, and being able to have someone who not only is a bicycle traveller themselves and learn about your journey, but also learn more about the Adventure Cycling Association. I feel like we're going to give a lot of information out there that's actually going to be handy to the listeners as well. But Jenn, a question which I start my show with, and I ask this of all my guests, is, do you remember the very first bike you ever rode?
I do. It was a red bike. It had training wheels, which is terrible. It was a hand-me-down. But I remember riding that bike, riding into fences because I was learning in a parking lot and, steering was kind of a foreign notion. But more importantly, I actually remember the first bicycle that I purchased, which I saved for months, my $99 to buy a 10-speed Huffy, which was the key to my freedom.
Oh, I love that. The key to your freedom. Fans of the show will know that the word freedom gets used so often when we talk about bicycles and the very feeling of what they give us. What sort of adventures did you take when you got that bike? I can imagine there must have been so much anticipation saving for it for so long.
Oh, definitely. Most of my adventures revolved around food, which shouldn't surprise anyone who's a cyclist. There was a 7-Eleven nearby, so I would go for Slurpees and a Dairy Queen so I could get my peanut butter parfait, all of the important things to a kid, which is sweets.
Oh, it's so true. It's funny, growing up in Australia, our adventures often would involve stuff like that. And we had things there which don't really exist so much now, like the corner store where you would ride to, and you could get genuine food, milk, bread and all those staples. But as a kid, you're going there for back in my day, it was like the 2 for 1 cent lollies. I don't know that they exist. 1 cent coins certainly don't.
Yeah.
Jenn, obviously, I can tell just obviously where you work now and what you've done. Bicycles and adventuring on a bike have really been a big feature of your life. But what sort of adventures were you taking as a child that weren't necessarily bike related? Like, was your family in the outdoors? Were you always an outdoorsy type of person?
I really didn't have that much exposure to the outdoors. It was not a family activity that we did at all. I remember one time we went camping. Honestly, I did not get involved with being outdoors until I was probably in my early 20s and involved in a serious relationship where it was really important to my partner to get out and do things. And they also introduced me then to bicycling. And that led me to helping to choose the college I went to, which was in Missoula, Montana, which was what took me there. And how I ended up at adventure cycling was that his love of adventure and my wanting to sort of have a great experience for both of us in my years at college.
Do you mix your adventures a bit now? Like, obviously, when your work is in that bicycle world and you also enjoy bicycle travel, do you mix it up with other things as well? Like, do you go hiking? Do you just enjoy time in the outdoors in general? Or do you find you're just all involved, immersed in this world, and the bicycle is just almost part of your identity in a way?
I do some of both. I'm fortunate to live in an area that has some nature areas that I can get to. So I don't really call it hiking. It's just walks in parks and things. And I try to use my bike for transport as much as I can, just as an opportunity to be outside. And my current partner and we do plan bicycle trips every year. That's a really important foundation for us of who we are as individuals and as a couple. So I would say that the bicycle is probably my main source of adventure. And that's my first serious relationship he was really into backpacking, and I was not into carrying a big heavy pack on my back, and I still am not. So I much prefer to put all my gear on my bike so that's a much easier way for my body to handle that.
Yeah, it's that slow and steady spinning circles. Might be slow movement, but it's not bearing down on your physical body.
Right.
I've taken a trip with a heavy backpack on my bike before. I just didn't have, it was before I had panniers. I didn't have the rack and gear. I had like some bike packing bags, and it just wasn't going to be enough in what I needed to do. And I remember it took me weeks to recover from that sort of back pain.
Yeah, yeah.
Sometimes you have to learn the hard way.
Unfortunately.
As I mentioned in my introduction, Jen, you're a cartographer. I just imagine you must look at a map with so many possibilities when you're creating, like that's part of your world as well. So when you're thinking up your own bike adventures with your partner now, are you the sage of wisdom there? Do you get to create that role, or do you share that amongst both of you as well?
We generally share that. My partner actually is very involved in the bicycle travel world as well. And so we bounce the ideas off of each other. And we know pretty much, what our tolerance and our desires are for daily mileages and what kinds of things we're looking for at the end of the day. We eagerly share links back and forth of different trips we've heard about and then figure out how to tailor it to what we want.
Oh, wow. Have you taken trips outside of the US with your bikes as well?
Unfortunately, I have not. We attempted a trip in Fernie, Alberta, right, in Canada. And unfortunately, it was one of the years when they had really bad fires. And literally the day we arrived in Fernie, a fire blew up and it was so smoky. I couldn't tell you if there were mountains in Fernie or not because it was so smoky. And yeah, but beyond that, I was on another trip. New Zealand is the only time I've been outside of North America. And there was a hope that I would get to do some bicycle traveling on that trip. Unfortunately, we were traveling in the shoulder season and it was so miserably rainy for so much of it that we opted not to do the bike trip. We just drove our camper van around and checked out some different hikes and things.
New Zealand is an amazing country to get inspiration from. It's so raw and in its beauty.
Mm-hmm.
I often found whenever I was in the outdoors or the wilderness areas there, it's almost like I remember there used to be like a marketing campaign for New Zealand, which was like pure oxygen. It's like you're breathing just purity.
Yeah. Yeah. So much greenery. It was just, it was really lovely.
You did find out the reason why. It does rain a lot.
Why there's rain.
It could potentially be the Southern Hemisphere's equivalent to the UK and Ireland.
Mm-hmm.
But a beautiful, beautiful country. I guess then your work there at the Adventure Cycling Association, your experience must be beyond compare to so many because of that as well. And as a cartographer, really involved in the route planning stuff. But it would be fair to say you're not just a cartographer. You embody the organisation. Working there for as long as you have, you must have seen so many different changes over the years as well.
Oh, definitely. When I first started at the organization, I think that we had just under 20,000 mapped miles across the country. And as you said in your intro, we now have over 52,000, which sounds even more impressive when you call it out in kilometers.
Yes.
And we didn't have the Great Divide mountain bike route or any of our off-road routes. So that's definitely been a shift, and one that I think is really exciting because it invites more people of different backgrounds and different desires to try out the whole idea of bicycle travel. And as an organization today, we still have all of the epic routes, the things that go border to border and coast to coast, but we're also sort of shifting our vision a little bit to have things that are more attainable on a regular basis. Oftentimes, a trip like a Transamerica Trail trip across the country is somebody's bucket list, something that they aim to do as a lifetime achievement. We want people to see bicycle travel also as something that can be part of your regular life, right? That you have a 3-day weekend coming up. And so why not drive an hour to get to a great location to do a 3-day bike trip or something? And so we're trying to incorporate those things into our network these days as well.
Yeah, that must be so exciting. And actually, something that's occurred to me as well, and you mentioned it, and this would be a big shift. Bicycle travel hasn't just occurred on asphalt surfaces by any measure for decades, right? Obviously not. But I feel the bike industry as a whole, and especially in America, I could definitely say in Australia as well, and in many other countries too, that shift towards what they would call gravel riding and gravel touring and stuff and bike packing and off-road routes, that has really taken off, and which I think is obviously off the back of people wanting to be on the path less travelled from a motor vehicle perspective as well. And so I imagine with that, you will have seen so much more popularity in those off-road routes that you're starting to create there as well, as that momentum just keeps growing and growing.
Definitely. And it's a high priority for us to build more of those kinds of routes into our network, to have routes that are maybe on gravel, or maybe, as you say, they simply are just not on a roadway shared with cars. So it's we would call it a separated path or a separated trail here in the US. And, those kinds of opportunities are growing across the country. Typically, it's on more of a state by state or maybe a regional basis rather than a nationwide basis. Although the Rails to Trails Conservancy has done some really amazing work in building their Great American Rail Trail, and they have made great strides towards completing a coast-to-coast route that somebody could ride all completely on separated trails, so you don't have to ride on the road at all. I believe they're over 40% of the way there in creating that at this point.
When you say 40%, when you think of the amount of distance from coast to coast, that's quite a lot of trail when you think about it, isn't it?
Yeah, and what's different in the United States versus, say, people oftentimes want to say, but Eurovelo has it. They have all of these routes all across their different countries. But I think there's a different sensibility or something around, the government structures, right? In the US, so many of these projects are on much more localized levels, whereas Eurovelo, there's a bit more cooperation and coordinated efforts to create those routes, whether they're in one country or across different countries. It's a bit more of a challenge to knit those things together across the US.
I don't know that it's a challenge that Eurovelo doesn't also face in ways. As someone who's travelled on some of the Eurovelo routes as well, from one route to another, there's differences in completion there and signage as well. And certainly it's also from one country to another as well. There's differences there, which I guess if I was to equate it back to what you were saying, Jen, you would probably see that on a state level or a county level or differences there as well, wouldn't you? In terms of infrastructure, what's available, what signage is available there too. I think something that I've read with the Adventure Cycling Association, because obviously you've got all these routes and you have amazing maps, but the other great part of it that I've understood from guests who've used them as well is there's such a large amount and a myriad of information, of detail for the type of things that someone traveling on a bike needs to use, like accommodation, food stops, rest areas, and things like that. They're all included in your maps there as well, aren't they?
Yeah. So not only, I mean, we feel really a lot of ownership over the routes that we have created and curated over time, but the services that we provide are kind of unique. I mean, anyone could throw a route across a Google map and Google will provide a bunch of services, but it won't point you to perhaps the small mom and pop hotel that really depends on that bicycle traveler stopping and staying a night. It won't tell you about the library and the fact that it's only open on Wednesdays from 4 to 8, or whatever sort of intricate details that are important to a cyclist, as well as bike shops. And then we have a whole category that is unique to our route system, which we call cyclist only accommodations. Essentially, they are both camping and indoor lodging things where various communities, private entities offer up their property for cyclists who are, for people who are traveling by bike across the country. And it's just a wonderful thing to see these communities support these bicycle travelers who are passing through.
Yeah, I think often the birth of a trail that's used by a lot of people cycling, that then boosts a lot of communities which are, I guess, economically going backwards in a way and finding it struggle. And that tourism boost has been a huge boom for them, and they're embracing of that. It's like that momentum, that rolling stone. It gets bigger and bigger with that. The more people that go to ride there, the more services there are that go on there, the more people know this is an amazing place to go to as well. So I'm imagining, Jen, that you are seeing not just your routes expanding in that way, but you probably also see this is happening too.
Oh, most definitely. We oftentimes field inquiries from people, from a cyclist who has passed through some community and told somebody about what they were doing, like a grocery store or a general store in a small community. And then that store will reach out to us and say, hey, how do we get more information about you and what you do? And how can we support cyclists? And we have a list of things that we suggest small stores in that situation carry that would support cyclists, so that they can benefit from the cyclists and they know how to take care of them, and the cyclists feel supported. And then the word of mouth out there on the trail is it's for real. When people get great service someplace, they like to let folks know about it, and then people follow up and repeat that experience themselves.
It would be remiss to me not to mention your membership there too at the ACA. I think, is it over 50,000 members?
That's correct, yes.
50,000 people with experiences talking to how many other hundreds of thousands of people about them as well. That's the opportunity there, isn't it?
Yes, most definitely.
Wow. Do you ever have like membership get-togethers or anything like that? Do you have events?
We don't do that very often. The last one we had was for our 40th anniversary in 2016. So yeah, it's about every 10 years we do some sort of an event. Yeah, and of course, because we're a nonprofit, whenever any one of us travels, like if I'm going to a conference someplace, typically I will try to arrange to hold some sort of an event in that place where my conference is, in order to get out the message and invite members and invite new people to bicycle traveling to come and learn more about what's new and fun at the adventure cycling.
It must be great for you to be able to possibly meet and speak with people who have been in contact with the association and hear about their experiences firsthand as well.
It's really fun. I sometimes feel like a rock star when I tell people that I'm a cartographer. Their eyes open wide, and I can't tell you, probably 75% of the time when I tell someone at one of those events that I'm a cartographer, the first thing that somebody follows it up with is, "Oh, I love maps. I've always loved maps." And so that's always a fun and exciting thing and great place to start that conversation about what I do and why I do it and who I do it for.
I've interviewed a guest who loves maps, lives and breathes maps, Mark Wedgwood. He's from the UK and they have Ordnance Survey maps, which I'm sure you've probably heard of as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
His challenge was to write every single OS map of the UK. From memory, Mark, I think you wrote 204 of them.
Wow.
Oh, yeah, it was an epic trip.
Definitely.
Actually, he's just completed another one with a future podcast episode in mind later on this year, hopefully. He rode from boring to dull.
That's great.
Which I think boring's in the US and dull is in the UK somewhere.
Uh-huh.
It was a big trip, and no doubt, I'm assuming he probably used some of your adventure cycling maps for his US part of that tour. Something that Mark said when I interviewed him, though, is when he looks at a map, to him it fills him with more joy than reading a book because it gives him thoughts of future adventures and possibilities, and he looks at maps as to own individual stories that could play out there. As a cartographer, Jen, I love that your job is creating maps, but how do you approach that, and how do you feel about maps? Like, how do you feel about your work that way? Firstly, do you have that joy for them still, or it's just part of you? And so,
yeah, I do still have that joy when I look at a map and figure out, would it be possible to do a trip between these two places? What do the roads look like? There's always a curiosity in looking at maps and all of the information that they hold. Sometimes I have to tell my cartographic critic to be quiet, though, because some people don't make maps the same way I think they should make maps, or their legend isn't as complete as it could be, or, I typically have lots of feedback for people on their maps. But when I can let go of that and just dive into the, looking at the roadways and the possibilities of destinations, that's definitely a dream.
I have to ask then, because there's certainly, and whether you're a bike traveler that's planning a route out, or you're just looking at from a point to point, or even other guests on my show and listeners are in the ultra cycling space and they're planning out a route map for an event and trying to find the most efficient way or the most logical way to get to a point to point. What would your top tips be for someone when they're actually seeking out routes themselves? Like, obviously, the Adventure Cycling Association, if you're seeking out a route in the US, has so much information there. But if someone's saying to you, I'm thinking of trying to figure out a best way to get from here to here, as a cartographer, how would you tackle that type of activity in your mind? Like, I guess another way to phrase it, how do you do it for yourself?
Yeah. Well, so first I want to caveat all of this with long live the paper map. I do believe in paper maps. I think they're critical and they're great. They're important for planning big picture trips, right? You want to see the context of where you're going. And today there are so many resources online that are really helpful. Tools like Ride with GPS is really amazing in the US. They have heat maps and you can, look at what other people have done, combine that with Google Street View to kind of get a sense of what things might look like, whether there's a shoulder, how much traffic, which is sometimes difficult to sense in that circumstance. And then I believe Komoot is a great resource in Europe for doing similar kind of planning. So I definitely highly recommend taking in everything that you can to try and distill the best route that will work for you. And I also caution in, don't over plan it or don't overthink it. There's at some point where you have to just kind of say, this looks like it's going to be the best thing, and put that down as the route you're going to take. And then you might meet a local at the convenience store that you stop at to get your, some hydration or a treat or something. And someone might give you another tip of a different way to go when you tell them where you're headed, and be open to the serendipity of that, right? Because sometimes the line on the paper is not nearly as exciting as having somebody who's lived there be able to give you the real lowdown on what would be a good
Having the local tip it's priceless. I love that idea. It's something I get asked by people, by listeners of the show who email in as well. And it's, I want to go from here to here. How far do you think I should go each day? How many days do you think it will take me?
route.
How should I do it? And one of my thoughts is, I believe personally, flexibility needs to be something that you pack into your pannier when you go bike touring, right?
Definitely.
Because things will change.
Yep.
And you were talking about Komoot there and Ride with GPS. I've used both of them extensively. I've used Strava a bit. I've used Google. I've used, and also maps.me. There's a term which we've mentioned a few times with different guests, which I resonate with, called being commuted, which is when you've taken a route, you've drawn something that's apparently plausible, but then all of a sudden the route goes through a riverbed or it goes through a brick wall or something like that. And I imagine you've had experiences of being commuted yourself.
Oh, I have, most definitely. And what was sort of reassuring is when it happened to me, a local came out of their home and said, "You're looking for a way to XYZ." And I'm like, "Yeah." And he goes, "Well, you got to hoof it through this, it was a brambly sort of trail for a good 100 yards, but it was way better than going back around the extra 5 miles that it was going to take me if I had to turn around at that point." But definitely lots of people had been commuted at that point, I guess.
Can I ask then, with that in mind, you must get a lot of feedback from people too then who are taking new routes or potentially saying, "Hey, this is here," or "Be aware of this." Do you get feedback like that that informs the evolution of a map too? Like, does a trail, it's never sort of final and set in stone? You're flexible to changing that map too?
Most definitely. One of the most important resources we have are people who are riding our routes. Having over 50,000 miles of routes, we can't look at every mile every day and always be adjusting to changing conditions, which in a country the size of ours and with different states having different priorities, we really rely on those pieces of feedback and have made several changes across the country. One really prominent example that springs to mind is when there was a gas boom that happened in North Dakota, and we had a couple of routes that were going through that area. Of course, we had heard about it, but it hadn't really come together as how much of an issue it was going to be for cyclists for this gas and oil boom that was happening. And we had a cyclist who happened to be a filmmaker as well. So he was out there with his camera and he took short videos of what he was experiencing out there. And we got a really crystal clear picture of how important it was for us to change that route and to get on it right away. We very quickly pivoted and changed that routing based on his firsthand experience of what was going on. And that made a drastic improvement in those routes for cyclists.
That's great that you're taking that feedback on board as well. I imagine conversely, like that's an example of where the route needed to change because of, things that were being developed that no longer potentially made the original version of it ideal. Conversely, you must hear from people, and I guess, forgive me, maybe I'm incorrect in assuming this, but in your role, the routing department there, would you be responsible for taking in those new sort of requests from members of saying, "Hey, have you thought about a route through this area?"
Mm-hmm.
Is that something that comes your way as well?
Most definitely we do. And I also want to say the feedback we get also is sometimes, "Here's a better route," or "Did you know this rail trail was built?" And so we can definitely make those kinds of changes, and we often do. And sometimes they're just, 5 or 10 mile stretches. And some of our, best ideas have come from folks who have sent us feedback or information based on their experience. And then we have developed a route around their idea. For a number of years, people were wanting a route that would go from New York City to Los Angeles. Now, we didn't end up creating one route that went from New York City to Los Angeles, but we did create 2 shorter routes that would achieve that same goal for folks. So we have our bicycle route 66, which goes from Chicago to LA based on the old Highway 66 in the US. And then we have Chicago to New York City. So folks can do that because a lot of people want to go between those, those major hubs, right? Those are like bucket list sorts of destinations.
I mean, that's a long distance version of it, but in a way it speaks to what you were talking about earlier in that giving people the possibility of breaking journeys down in chunks as well. They're still two very sizable chunks. But I guess there would be an element that people can take one of the routes that you've got developed there and break it down into sections as well, achievable sections for them. And whether it's 3 days, whether it's 3 weeks, whether it's 3 months, you can do that. Jen, a key question for a cartographer, and you hinted that you look at maps and think, oh, I would add this detail or that detail. What makes a good map?
I think a great legend is an important part of a map. It should just have this intuitive feel. I should be able to look at the map and have a sense of what it's like on the ground. So good hill shading, I think, is important in appropriate places, different gradations of roads so that I have a sense of whether this is a road that's going to carry a lot of traffic versus not a lot of traffic. That reminds me of bicycle traveler Willie Weir, who, when he's planning a trip, he pulls out his map and he always looks for the thin, squiggly line because that's going to be the road that has the most adventure on it. And so me as a cartographer, I get that. He is associating with that map that thin, squiggly line means, maybe we don't know a lot about that road, but we know there is a road there. So we've drawn this line. That to me is an intuitive reading of that map versus a bold red line probably means, an interstate or a truck route. And I'm going to avoid that at all costs.
Can I ask, just quickly, in Australia, we have a notion of paper roads, which are roads that in theory exist but actually don't. So they might exist and they wouldn't necessarily come up in like a Google map or something. This might be at a council level or something. Do you have the same sort of phenomena, or have you planned to go down a road that just doesn't exist?
Yeah, I think actually that has happened more with the advent of services like Google, in that I think sometimes Google makes a leap that there must be a road here where there isn't actually. And that happened to me on my big trip. I was in Maine. I had mapped this, what I thought was a off the beaten path route instead of taking this highway. And that was when that person came out and told me, yeah, you saw the line on the Google map, but it's not really there because it's just this, 2-track sort of grown over 100-yard road, quote unquote. So I would say that interestingly enough, there are more of those roads now today with technology than there probably were in the past.
Something that I've learned is the importance of when that's happened to me to go into because I feel a lot of these maps are drawn from open street maps. So this come from the same big pool of data. And I remember when it happened, something I've started doing was actually going in, setting myself up as an account on OS Maps and recorrecting the type of road. Is that the right thing to be doing, or what would you suggest as a cartographer that people do when this has occurred to them?
I think that's a great action to take for sure. There are and infrastructure is changing so quickly all across the world, I think, that it's impossible to have any map, whether it's digital or paper, be 100% accurate. And so if that's important to you, I wholly support folks doing citizen mapping via OSM. I think that's a wonderful step to take.
Yeah, and I guess if you're in the States, hook in a contact at the Adventure Cycling Association team.
Go. Yes, that works.
You've got a whole department there in charge of route mapping.
Yeah.
So you can help out with that as well.
Yes.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Do your routes then also, because I know, you purposefully factor in areas that a cyclist would need to, resupply, water availability, food availability, where to stay, where you can seek shelter and stuff. Are your routes then logically sort of formed in a way that for a pure beginner, do you have suggestions of distances and stuff in there as well?
Well, I mean, it's really challenging for us as individuals to tell someone else as an individual what they should do, because again, that sort of adventure thing can happen. Like when on my big trip, I this was probably one of my big regrets of that trip is I had a day planned where I was going to go from Buffalo to someplace in Canada. I don't even remember what the end destination was. It was that unconsequential. But at the border crossing, I met these really lovely people. They invited me to come to their home that evening and stay there with them, but it didn't get me to my destination that I needed, quote, needed to get to that night. And so I passed on that opportunity and I regret it. I wish I hadn't forced myself to stay on schedule because I had set myself up with a schedule. Flexibility can really provide the spark for things you never even expected you might discover about yourself or about where you're at. And that said, everyone knows themselves or should know themselves well enough to know approximately how many miles they think they can do in a day. But you need to factor in, is there a mountain pass that day or is it relatively flat? How many services are available? Do I actually need to make a certain distance in order to have someplace to stay at the end of the night or to get food for a meal or to top off all my water bottles, which is, why our maps are chock full of all of that kind of information so that folks can make those decisions more on the spur of the moment. Like, you know what, today is turning out to not be a great day, so I'm going to stop early because I see that I can, or I'm really rocking it today. I've had a tailwind all day. I'm going to do an extra 20 miles and get a little further because I see there's a way for me to do that and have a place to be.
Tailwind days, do they exist?
I hear about them.
Yeah. Every now and then for a moment.
Yeah.
Because conversely, some of the hardest days I've ever done on a bike have definitely not been when the bike's gone uphill. It's when it's been on a long, flat road, straight into a raging headwind or a side wind as well.
Yes.
Are there states in America that are prone to more wind that way?
Wind is a really interesting question, which is one that we get fairly regularly.
You must get that all the time. You must get it all the time.
Yeah. The truth of the matter is that I think people, first of all, oftentimes you don't feel it when you have a tailwind. You just think, wow, what a great day that was. That was easy. And you don't necessarily realize that you had a tailwind at certain points. And oftentimes side winds can feel like a headwind, but they really are more of a side wind. So people always ask, is it better to go east to west or west to east on our particular routes? Oh, I heard it's terrible crossing Kansas going east, or I heard it's terrible crossing Kansas going west. And some days in Kansas are just terrible no matter which direction you're going because it's a pretty flat, open place and there's a lot of wind. And you're going to be impacted it regardless of which direction that you're going.
Yeah, that's one of the big things with Unbound, I know. And is it the Flint as well? Like on the dirt roads there as well? The gravel is very different there too. It's more prone to potentially...
Yeah, that might be. I'm not familiar with that.
There's a sense of which way the prevailing winds will be, but they don't prevail 365 days a year.
Right. And oftentimes people will equate the jet stream with surface winds. And surface winds are the winds you're concerned about. The jet stream has very little impact on what you're experiencing when you're on your bike, unless it's bringing in a storm, in which case ask any weather person and they know it's a game of odds. Sometimes they're right on forecasting and sometimes they're not.
And storms is a great one because they also create their own wind.
Yes, they do.
It's amazing being out in those atmospheric conditions, only if you know that you'll be safe. But I love the outdoors, Jen, as you can probably tell. I'm a keen photographer. I love cloud watching, massive cloud appreciation folk here.
Yeah.
Yeah, the storm clouds that come with those, but the wind that gets whipped up with them as well.
Right. And I experienced a tremendous amount of rain on my big bike trip in 2017 that I certainly was not anticipating to have literally, I think I had 3 weeks where I didn't have a single day without some rain, if not torrential rain. It was, yeah.
Let's talk about your big trip there then. Like I said, from Maine to Seattle, the long way.
Yeah, that was the aim for sure. Yeah.
So when a cartographer decides to go the long way, knowing that you plan flexibility to some degree within your route plans as well, what are the things that you're looking to include when you're setting off? Do you plan highlights? Is it a case that you've lived and breathed these routes for so long, your curiosity wants to be on those roads yourself? How do you come up with an idea for your own big journey?
It took me a long time to even have the urge to do a big trip. So I was working for the organization in 2016 when we had our 40th anniversary. And it took being surrounded by people who had done big trips years and years ago and hearing them absolutely experience or express zero regret for any of the bicycle trips they had ever done, for it to finally dawn on me that, okay, I guess I'm ready to do a big trip. And I happened to say that out loud in front of one of our board members, who turned and looked at me, and I went, oh crap, I just committed myself.
Nothing like saying it out loud, is it, to hold you
Yeah,
accountable?
right. And as iconic as our Transamerica Trail route is, it wasn't the one that pulled to me. I wanted to follow more the Northern Tier route. And I think part of that had to do with there were places on that route that I wanted to see. And I knew people who lived along that route. So that was part of what drew me to that, to choosing that. And I customized it in places. One of the things that I wanted to see was in Dalbo, Minnesota, the Adventure Cyclist Bunkhouse.
Oh my gosh, we need to talk about this. Absolutely. I
Yes.
heard about it from another show guest, Eric Lederer, who actually he did ride from LA to New York, and he went up the Pacific coast, did a loop through Washington, and then went across. But he spoke about his experience there as well on the show.
Yeah,
It just sounds like such an amazing place to be at.
it was. Yeah, Don Olson, a trail angel, definitely. He's not a cyclist, he's a farmer. And there was road construction going on the road out in front of his farm. And there were these two cyclists who stopped at his driveway, and he could see them looking at a map, and they were trying to figure out what to do because this road construction was really messing with their plans and stuff. And so he just went out and talked to him and said, what are you guys doing? And they told him they were riding this Northern Tier thing. And he got really intrigued. And he said, well, I have this old dairy barn where it's an empty building. You're welcome to come pitch your tents there and stay here overnight. And that was in like 2009 or 2010. And so by the time I visited him in 2017, he had the dairy barn outfitted with something like 6 private little rooms. It had a kitchen. He was stocked the kitchen with food and just asked for donations to cover his costs. He had a solar heated shower. He had just upgraded the outhouse to an actual flush toilet. It was an amazing experience to get to stay with Dawn at the bunkhouse. So that was definitely something I had to do.
Were there other people doing their own travels that were there that night or that day when you were there as well?
Some folks came through at one point, I think it was as I was leaving. So I didn't get a chance to hang out with too many other cyclists, but I did have friends meet me there. And then we started traveling together from there. So from Cape Elizabeth, Maine, all the way to Dalbo, I was traveling solo. And then I had a couple of friends join me at Dalbo, and we rode in Minnesota for about 10 days, I guess.
So was it before your friends joined you that you had the 3 weeks of torrential continuous rain?
Yes.
Wow. So my big questions here for you then, Jen, is it's one thing to commit out loud and to start out on a trip like this. And I always think when we plan trips, we don't plan the bad weather.
No, not usually.
No. So when you're in it and you're on your own and it is miserable weather for so long, was there parts of you that just questions louder than you want, why am I continuing with this?
Oh, I was pretty committed that I was going to do it, but I was also pretty miserable some days. Thankfully, I stayed connected to friends and family while I was on my trip and got lots of encouragement. I also sprinkled in some stays at hotels, and I took up offers for rides a few times as well. One memorable ride came out of, so I was riding a ferry in Vermont to New York, and I ran into this couple. He saw my rig, my bike rig, and came over and chatted me up, and he talked about how he'd done part of the Great Divide, and he was a bicycle traveler himself and all this stuff. And then he hands me this card. He says, I'm going to be in the area for the next 3 weeks. If you need anything, you let me know. And I took his card and I just smiled and I said, oh, thanks. And I didn't think, I'd ever see him again. Literally a week later, I was so far behind my schedule because unfortunately I didn't build enough flexibility into my plan. I had a friend flying in from Seattle to meet me in Buffalo, New York for 4th of July. So I needed to get there in time to meet her, and I was not going to make it pedaling by myself. So I texted him and he met me someplace and he took me, I don't know, a couple 100 miles so that I could make my date with my friend in Buffalo. So, yeah.
Oh my gosh, like the generosity.
Oh,
Yeah, definitely. And it is something you can't plan those occurrences with strangers on the road. You don't know
no.
they exist. You don't know who it's going to be even.
Right.
You can't plan that they're going to happen, but I almost feel, speaking with all of my guests on this show, it's the overwhelming, resounding theme to these adventures is that these things do happen.
Yeah.
Did you set out looking forward to embrace that? I mean, you had taken smaller trips before, but I feel, Jen, your first big trip and solo in miserable weather, those moments must have been so much more uplifting.
Most definitely. Yeah, of course, being part of adventure cycling, I had heard about trail angels and people's experiences. So there was not an expectation, but I was open to the idea that people would offer me things or offer to help. And I had received a piece of great advice before I left from a friend who had done long distance traveling. She said, when people offer to help you with something, say yes as often as you can, because you're not also receiving what they have to offer, but you're allowing them the gift of giving. And that's as important as anything you might receive, is to have them experience the giving as well. And I took bottles of water that I didn't need. And, I never threw anything away. I always ended up using whatever somebody gave me. But there were certainly times when, like, I didn't need to take his card and his phone number on that Vermont ferry because I was fine. I was going to make it all on my own. But I'm really glad that I said yes and thank you and that I took him up on his offer.
Sometimes it's also the beginning of a beautiful friendship as well.
Mm-hmm.
I know I've certainly spoken about this on the show. I must have, because who I'm about to say here is a really dear friend of mine. She's been a guest twice now. That's you, Stevie Tisson. And we met in a serendipitous moment doing our very first long distance event. And neither of us had to string up a conversation together on the start line, but nervously we did, and setting out as two solo females. And we now have a really strong friendship together and have planned trips together, had some planning future trips to see each other and stuff like that. You don't know the possibilities of that either, do you?
Exactly.
Like, do you finish a big trip like this then, Jen, with a new list of friendships made as well, in a way? Like, this person drove you 200 miles, didn't need to.
Yeah.
I bet you've still got his card somewhere.
I think I do, somewhere in my collection of maps from my trip. He's probably still in my phone, honestly. That's really an interesting observation. And I think it didn't happen for me quite that way. And I think it had to do with where I was in my personal journey. And part of the reason of taking the trip, I was at a transformational time in my life. My marriage was ending. So this was an opportunity for me to do a lot of deep reflection and assessment. And so I think I probably in some ways put off a vibe that I wasn't very available. So while I did have some great trail angel kinds of experiences and connections, I was on an inward journey at that time as well that I think sort of kept me from creating a lot of those connections. And I had people that I knew I was meeting along the way. So I still had, the experience of having deep connection. It just was with people I already knew.
Hello, listeners. It's Bella here, host and producer of Seek Travel Ride. Many of you have recently gotten in touch with me to find out how you might be able to support the show. I am an independent podcaster, which pretty much means I sort of do everything. I research my guests, I interview them, I put their audio together and I do an edit of that, and then obviously I release the episodes and market them as well. It's been a great experience now for just over a year, and we have 60 episodes in the bag as well. But pretty much if you do want to support the show and show some love to the content that I have been producing, I have recently set up a Buy Me a Coffee account. It's just a way that you can financially contribute to the show and put some funds towards the running costs of producing this podcast. I'm very proud to be an independent podcaster, and whilst it does mean there's a lot of work on this show at my end, it's an absolute joy to bring it to you at your end. I have included a link in the show notes to my Buy Me a Coffee account there, so if you want to support the show, just click on that link. Once again, thank you all so much for your support. Now let's get back to the episode. That's valid and totally fair as well, because ultimately you're taking this trip for yourself. It has its own purpose, and everyone's purpose for a long-distance bike tour is different. For some, it's I want to see everything along the way. For some, it's I want to see if I can get to there.
Yeah.
I imagine, Jen, something that would have changed partway through the trip is those interactions, just because you transition from traveling on your own to then also having company partway. Did you notice how that changed your trip? Did you observe those changes?
Yeah, I mean, the group size that I was traveling with, it ended up being 3 of us, and I think that is a small enough group that we still had people sort of paying attention to us and noticing us and asking us questions about what we were doing. But we certainly didn't get the offers of help or assistance that I had been getting when I was traveling solo. And that was all, I mean, it was all fine because we were relying on one another and we were in good shape. And we're all pretty capable adults and would have asked for anyone for help if it turned out that we had needed it. But definitely, and we had one man in the group, one man and 2 women. And so I think that makes a difference. I think gender presentation makes a difference as well. Also, we were 3 white people in the middle of Minnesota, so there was no racial concerns or curiosities. We were just some sort of folks out doing their bike thing. So I think we would have had more interest if we had been more unique, I guess.
I talked about this with a very recent guest, Daniel Troyer. He's a documentary maker. He's released a multi-award winning film called We Are All in This Together. You may have heard of him. He biked across the US with no food and no money to see how far the kindness of strangers would take him. And I mean, he dumpster dove for a while too, on the basis knowing that so much legitimate good food is thrown out each day,
right?
Unfortunately. But we did speak about this, his experience, and he talks about it in the documentary and flashes it up there as a point as well, is his experience was vastly different because he was white.
Mm-hmm.
He met a bike traveler, a person of colour, who was treated vastly differently, unfortunately, because of that too. Your point there too, that a man in the group changed that too.
Mm-hmm.
When you were a solo female, I imagine there's a perception that you're more vulnerable. But as a solo female, did you feel more vulnerable?
Honestly, there was only one time that I literally had the experience of, I can't stay here. This is not going to work for me to stay at this location overnight. I will not sleep if I try to stay here. Most of the time, I felt quite safe and secure and didn't worry about my safety as a solo traveler.
Yeah.
So I feel quite lucky there was only that one experience. Yeah.
Can I ask what it was about that location? Was it the vibe was wrong, or was it a person there? Or
Yeah, it was in Michigan. And, it had been a great riding day. I was getting into camp like at 2:00 in the afternoon and feeling really good about having having a short day, and I was excited. And I could hear a lot of noise. I could see where the campground was, and I could hear a lot of noise. And it was like, well, I hope that's only, daytime activity, and they'll settle down, overnight. And I had stopped to have a snack, and a man in a red truck with particular iconography on the tailgate of his truck, and his personal look. He had, and I try really hard not to judge people on how they look, but it was a lot of things that came together that left me with this feeling. So from how his vehicle looked, he had a shaved head. He was very tattooed, and he was wearing mirrored sunglasses, but he was looking at me for quite a long time before he pulled away. And that just gave me chills. And I just thought, I can't stay in this community. I just didn't feel safe. And so I pulled out my map and I rode to the next town, where I went to the library and asked them for help for a place to stay, because there were no vacancies at the hotels and no campgrounds nearby. But yeah, so
You are the judge of how you feel. Whether or not anything would have happened, you will never know. But
right,
it impacted on you enough to need to change. And I feel you've got to trust that you're making the right decision for you there as well. Can
right.
I ask, you said you went to the local library to ask for assistance. Is that a
Mhm.
hot tip? Are they areas in the States and in these smaller sort of communities where if you're traveling on a bike, they're what you should be seeking out for that type of stuff?
It's my belief that libraries are the hub of small communities in particular. Yes. Years and years ago, back in the day of internet cafes, we had people writing to us and saying, "Why don't you list internet cafes on your map so that I can send email to my people?" It was before social media, but I think that it was an infancy of blogs and people wanting to have internet connection. And we sort of had a bad feeling about whether internet cafes were going to continue. So we didn't want to add those to the map, because that's a pretty laborious process. But around the same time, Microsoft and the Gates Foundation granted money to libraries all across the country to have computers with internet access in them, freely available to their communities. And so we decided, what a brilliant idea. We should add libraries to our routes, because people passing through would be able to stop and go to the library for that connection, whereas an internet cafe was not necessarily as reliable. And then of course librarians, just, I don't know what it is about them, but they tend to know all the things about the communities that they live in. And that was definitely my experience when I stopped in this small Michigan library, when I wrote in and said, I need a place to stay tonight. I understand churches can be open to that. Which one do you suggest I start with? And they actually picked up the phone and started calling for me.
Because I have heard that as well from previous guests too, that churches are a place that bike travellers are accepted to stay overnight and will welcome them as well. So
Hmm.
that seems quite a cool thing. And yeah, it's the importance of that type of a resource for someone to be able to go to and find out the information that they need to find out as well. That is really, really cool. Something I'd like you to do, Jen, is it's a relatively new question that I've started asking people, which was suggested to me by Jack Greenwood, who is a long distance bike traveller himself. He says it's always hard when people say, "Tell me about your trip," because it's like, where do you start, right?
Yeah.
Especially if it's a trip that's more than a long weekend. So instead, he says the best question to ask someone, and I've taken this on and stolen this idea from him and I'm unashamedly using it from now on and forevermore, is tell me about a day of your trip. And I wonder if you could take the time now to pick a day. It can be any day you choose. The weather can be doing whatever. Maybe it's a magic tailwind day. Maybe you're in the mountains. Maybe you're on the flatlands, in a city, in the country. I don't care. On your own or with others. But tell me about a day of your tour.
The day that immediately comes to mind was probably the hardest day of my trip, which also led to great satisfaction at the end of the day. Was the day, it was early in my trip. I think it was a week or 10 days in. I don't remember exactly, but it was really early in my trip. And another thing to know is I started my trip fairly early. I started it in mid-June, which, coming from Montana, I had a trainer inside my home and rode that way, but I didn't have a lot of training because winter can last a long time in Montana. But I was riding the Kankamangas Pass, which is in New Hampshire, and it's really windy and steep. And so that in itself was difficult. Second, it was a super hot day. It was like 95 degrees, even on that pass. And I don't do super well in heat. I was completely miserable. And thirdly, it was the last day of, quote, biker week in the state of New Hampshire. It doesn't mean cyclists, though,
No.
unfortunately. It means motorcyclists. So I was constantly, for hours on hours, passed by people on Harleys. And boy, those are some of the loudest vehicles you'll ever encounter.
They really are.
Yeah. So I was miserable.
Some of them, I think, are purposefully loud,
I think,
obnoxiously loud on purpose
yeah,
just when they pass you.
yeah, I do too. I do too. And yeah, so it was an extremely hard day. I'd been really anxious about it from the days I was planning my trip. I was a couple of miles from the top and I was starting to bonk. I was at the end of my energy reserves. I hadn't had much cell coverage through the day, but by some miracle, I was so low that I called my best friend because I needed some help to get myself to the top. And that was the only thing I could think of to do. And miracles of miracles, I got through to her. She pep talked me, she reminded me I could walk. I didn't have to ride because I didn't have it in me to ride for at that point. It was just too steep. I knew I was going to fall over. There was not enough shoulder. And I made it through. I ended up riding to the top. And that's one of my very favorite pictures of the trip as I set up my little tripod and a timer and got myself a selfie with the big old Kankamangas sign. And
What a great name,
yeah,
FYI.
yeah,
Kankamangas. I've not heard of it before, but I'm definitely going to look it up now.
yeah. I think it's probably based on an indigenous tribal name, but I haven't actually looked into it. Yeah, it was a tremendous achievement. That was the hardest cycling day I've ever had and one of my most triumphant memories as well of making it to the top in one piece.
Given you were so energy depleted as well, and being able to achieve something that would have just felt impossible, no doubt.
Yeah.
I love that you phoned a friend to help you get through. That's awesome. That's a great hot tip. What I want to know now is, what did you eat for dinner? Did you eat all the things?
I think I had a pizza.
Oh,
I made it
yay.
down to the bottom and found a
Yum.
pizza. The other thing to know about me, about my trip that's a little bit unique is that I eat a vegan diet. So sometimes it was a bit of a challenge finding calorie dense foods that didn't have dairy or meat in them.
Were you able to stick to that the whole way through? I know I've had previous guests who are vegan as well, and they've had challenges where they've just had to accept it's not going to be possible 100% of the time, which has been hard for them to deal with internally,
Hmm.
but was necessary. Did you have anything like that at all, or did you manage the whole trip sticking vegan?
I think I probably was 90 to 95% of the time. There were times when I didn't ask questions and I just said thank you and I ate things and I didn't think about whether, I mean, like a baked good, I would go into a cafe and I was going to get something. It didn't matter, at that point. I just needed something. I wanted something. And so there were definitely times when I just didn't ask the question and I just did what I needed to do. And there were more days than I want to count where I had Fritos and bean dip and Oreos for lunch because that was all that I could find that was calorie dense and vegan. Healthy, maybe not. Yeah.
I've heard Oreos feature quite a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. I was delighted when I discovered that Fritos bean dip is vegan. And so, because I don't make it with lard.
I actually don't know what this is. This must be a very uniquely American thing.
So it's like there's a particular kind of chips that they make that goes with this little tin of bean dip. So it's like refried beans essentially, but it's a little softer so you can dip your chip into it and it doesn't break. Yeah.
Sounds like it's got the right combination of calories and
Yes.
salt
And I
too.
usually would top it off with a V8 if I could find it.
Oh, hang on now. What's a V8? We're on a food journey here. I'm a big food loving fan. Food always features on every episode, so this is good. But what is a V8?
It's a tomato based juice. So V8 has 8 vegetables in it. So yeah.
Something I want to know, working where you work at the ACA and having, in a way, through osmosis, hearing through everybody's trips and things, when it came to packing, was there like a key item that you would perhaps it's your non-negotiable, this has got to come with me? And is it a paper map?
Oh, definitely the paper maps are pretty high on my list. Although I did put my route into Ride with GPS and navigated oftentimes, but at night I would always look at the map, to figure out where I was going next. One of the things I don't often see on people's packing lists that I think is pretty handy is a mini sewing kit. And I did use mine a few times to repair just small little things before they became big things that were more problematic. And then I also had wasn't Tyvek tape, but it was some sort of a really heavy duty tape that I put on a pencil so that I could just pull off, a big roll of tape and heavy. You don't want to carry that with you, but I just moved some over onto a pencil, and which was really good because early on in my trip, I put a hole in my tent and I was able to repair it with that heavy duty tape, and it never caused me a problem the whole time.
Yeah, I affectionately call that tape, a lot in Australia, we call that tape 100-mile-an-hour tape. It can be blowing 100 miles an hour and it'll still hold together.
Yes.
And I've heard people use the hat. You were talking about a pencil. Other people and use this and have it on their bike permanently. If they have like a hand pump attached to their bike, they'll wrap that around the pump
That's a great idea.
because then it's always there.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Right.
What type of tent do you have?
I have a big Agnes ultralight something. I don't remember which one. It's a copper something, I think. And it's a two-person tent. I went with the slightly heavier two-person tent versus a one-person because I like having some space.
Oh, I'm on board. I'm totally on board with that. When I've toured with my husband, we have a 3-person tent. I have the luxury of 2 people to cart that, obviously. He typically takes the actual tent structure and the fly, and I have like the poles and
Hmm.
all those sort of things as well.
Yeah.
But we just love the fact that it's got a vestibule area so you can
Hmm.
have your stuff
Yep.
inside, and it means that there's a section of the tent which is just sleeping stuff.
Yeah.
So I don't know about you, Jen, but whenever I'm on tour, it's almost like there's sometimes an air of chaos when things are coming out of the panniers and
Yeah, I think that was the thing. One of the things that kept me from doing a big bike trip for so many years was the idea of packing and unpacking every day felt really daunting to me until my best friend, who's also a bicycle traveler, threw out the idea of the way she does it, which is certain panniers hold certain things all the time. So there's a sense of organization to it. And once I sort of like figured out like this pannier is my bedroom thing. So, I shove my sleeping bag in there and any sleeping clothes and things. And this is my first aid and warm clothes pannier. And this is my kitchen. So my stove and any food I have all go in this pannier. That was a game changer for me to have a bit of an organization system made it feel more manageable.
yeah, and you really start developing a routine then in packing and unpacking
Yeah,
that. There's always still one item that you can never find.
always.
Maybe that's a Bella problem. My hot tip, just while we're talking about what to pack, and I totally agree with you on the sewing kit and the tape, the zip ties I'd added in. My other one is a pair of tweezers, and it's not
Mm,
so I can pluck my eyebrows. It's more if there's a bit of horrible little piece of wire or thorn or something that gets stuck in your tire.
mm,
Sometimes you don't have the dexterity in your fingers to be able to grip onto something that
yeah,
small to actually rip it out of there
yeah.
and you need to get it out, otherwise it's going to, unless you're running tubeless, it's going to pierce your tire and your new tube again as well. So I think that would be my little extra little hot tip of what I
Hmm.
would pack.
It's interesting you mentioned that. I did bring tweezers and they got used, but not for that purpose. So I mentioned that it rained a lot in the first part of my trip. Well,
You tested the waterproofness of your tent.
yes, I did. I woke up and surrounded by water more than once. However, all of that rain and the lush, tall grasses that it sprouted also harbored ticks. And one day I was doing a tick check and thankfully, I was staying at a warm showers host that night, and I quickly ran to my warm showers host with my tweezers in hand and said, "I've got a tick. Can you help me?" And so she pulled the tick out of my shoulder for me. It was like one of the creepiest experiences for me.
It's pretty unsettling.
Lots of people experience it all the time, and that was my first time, and I did not like it.
I'd hate to experience it all the time. I experienced it more times than I wanted last year. I think 4 times.
Mm.
And actually for me, you were saying it was in your shoulder. For me, bizarrely, they've always been in like at the back of my knee, that crease in your leg.
Oh, yeah.
You know what creeps me out more than ticks is leeches.
Oh.
Yeah.
We could talk about all of those things for a while.
Quickly, something I noticed when I was looking at the photo log that you had of your trip there was something that does feature, and it reminded me so much of Australia. There's lots of photos of you in front of big things, as in like, the community town's big statue of, I don't know, it could be like a corn cob or it
Yeah.
could be like a cowboy or something like that. Did you have a favorite big thing photo?
Well, when I was on the last part of my trip in Minnesota, we were riding the Paul Bunyan trail system. And so there were a lot of statues of Paul Bunyan. And so we were on a quest to get our pictures taken with every Paul Bunyan we could find. Yeah, so that was what you were seeing there.
I must ask, Jen, taking trips like this changes you, obviously, and you were seeking that inward sort of reflection for this trip as well. How do you feel having undertaken the big journey? You said for so long you weren't sure that a big journey was for you. You were surrounded by people and made the
Mhm.
made the decision out loud and committed to it. But how do you feel having taken the big one?
I actually think about it. I don't know that I think about it every day, but I think about it often, at least once a week. There's something that reminds me of that trip or reminds me of the greater confidence I have in myself. I think that was probably my biggest takeaway is that I could plan, execute, enjoy this experience, and it gives me the same confidence in taking on new things in my work or in my personal life as well of I can do it. I have it within me to figure this out, to do this new challenging thing.
It's such a great thing to be able to reflect back on, isn't it?
Mhm.
To
Sure.
be able to give yourself that proper self-confidence boost from the things that you've achieved.
Yes. Yes, definitely was key to my experience.
As a cartographer, did you get to the point where you unfurled the map on the table when you got back home? You may have done this before you left and had it all dotted out, I'm not sure. But do you now look at places on that map and similar to Mark Wedgwood, it's not a map anymore, it's a storybook?
Mm. Yeah, it's been a long time since I've pulled out those maps. I wonder what my experience would be to pull out my maps and look at that. That would be a fun experiment.
I'd love for you to do it and then message me and tell me what it was like.
Okay, I will. I will.
That'd be great. I guess also, before I wrap it up, I'd love to know what your perception of the States is now, like the US, having taken that big trip as well. Notwithstanding you took mini adventures beforehand or any other travel you had, but experiencing it in that manner on a slow travel bicycle tour, did what you set out to do marry up with what your perceptions were at the end as well, and with those sort of reflective points?
Well, we have people come through our office really regularly. And one of my favorite things to do when I was there to be able to greet people was to ask, tell me your top 3 things that have been the best part of your trip. And nearly every time, at least in the top 3, people would say the people have been the best part of their trip, the people they've met. And I would certainly echo that in that I think most people, most of the time, when given the opportunity, want to be helpful. And that is a great confirmation because it's definitely not what we see in the media. Putting it in perspective, I was riding in the summer of 2017, which was, after kind of a tumultuous election cycle in the US. And I was a little bit uncertain what I might encounter. just because of knowing that our country had been through this really tumultuous time. And I don't want to put too much energy on that, but I was certainly aware that I was going to be writing in parts of the country where I might meet people different than me who had beliefs and interests that might vastly diverge from mine. And just the same, for the most part, I ran into people who were kind and wanted to be helpful and who were curious more than I ran into people who might meet some stereotype of a rural American of being. I don't even want to repeat the stereotypes because that's not who I met. Who I met were good, kind people who wanted to do the right thing.
I have to cheekily ask, though. Obviously, people are in your top 3. What are the other 2?
Well, for me or for other people?
For
Oh,
yourself.
for myself, the sense of accomplishment and achievement, confidence building. I think that definitely features in that top 3. And I guess this is sort of related to the people thing, but it's about the specific people in my life. I felt very supported by the people in my life, even though many of them don't do bicycle travel or don't do it or have a desire to do it in the way that I do it. They were all supportive and they sent me care packages with letters. And unbeknownst to me, they set up a phone tree to make sure there were people going to check in with me every few days. I had a friend fly out from Seattle to Buffalo to hang out with me for 3 days. I had 2 friends willing to meet me and do part of the trip with me. I had friends who put me up in their home that I'd only ever met via email. So I think that was a further reinforcement that I am loved in this world, and I am forever grateful for that.
That's an awesome thing to take that. As I said, you set out with that journey looking for inner reflection. That's an awesome finding from that moment of reflection, isn't it? That's so, yeah, helps you stand up nice and tall and proud. I love it. It's really, really great. Oh, Jenn, I could speak to you forever. I know that we've got so many things that we didn't touch on, and it happens with every guest because your stories are so captivating. I do know that there will be listeners to this episode who will want to find out more about not just you, but also the great work of the Adventure Cycling Association. What's the best way, other than just putting it into Google, what's the best way to get in touch and find out more and discover more about the ACA?
Our website is full of fabulous resources from routes to how-tos. I would highly advocate exploring adventurecycling.org. We've got the epic routes and we've got short routes. There's a plethora of information on our website, and there's a contact us if you have a specific question you want to ask. I go to that area and drop in your question, and someone on my team will get back to you with good information and some advice, perhaps.
Fantastic. I will definitely provide links in the show notes to that as well. Okay, Jenn, the final 3 questions. These are short and sharp ones. I ask them to all my guests to finish the show off with. First one is music themed because there is a Seek Travel Ride playlist available now, everybody, on Spotify and also on Apple Music too. Just search for Seek Travel Ride and you'll see it come up there. But that playlist, Jenn, consists of a song chosen by every guest to sum up their tours. In a way, it's what song would you choose to be the soundtrack to this trip? So what song were you going to pick for me?
Living in the Moment by Jason Mraz.
I don't know if I know the song, but I love the title.
Yeah, he is very fun musician. I really enjoy his music, and that's one of my favorites, and I think it really exemplified that trip for me.
Did music play a theme for you? Like, did you cycle with music at all when on your trip at all?
No, I don't like to. That's I know people listen to music and podcasts when they ride, and that's not part of my deal. I think I listen to music sometimes in the evenings, but I was really aware of not wanting to run down my phone battery too, so I oftentimes just was with my own thoughts.
Okay, final 2 questions. First one, you have a choice one day. You're going to be on your bike riding and you can choose whether you would like to cycle perpetually up a constant hill climb, or conversely, perpetually into a constant headwind? Which one are you going to choose?
Well, back in 2017, I was a pretty good climber, even though that day on the Kank really, the Kankamangas really was tough. I would probably prefer to climb versus the headwind because there's always the chance that that climb is going to end, right? The headwind, it just feels like it's never going to end. And there's no way I can predict when it's going to end. Whereas the climb, I might be able to estimate when that could be over.
Listeners, another person on Team Hill Climb, which outnumbers Team Headwind easily by
Yeah.
more than 10 to 1.
Yeah. Great.
Okay, final question for you, Jen. You're going to be riding your bike hypothetically for 4 hours one day. Would you choose to cycle for 4 hours on your own or 4 hours with other people?
Ooh. Well, can I ask a clarifying question?
Oh, go for it. Just as long as it means you're not going to be sitting on the fence.
Am I cycling in a new to me place or a familiar to me place?
I'm going to say new to you because this is all about exploring new possibilities.
If it's new to me, then I would love to be with one or two other people. I typically don't like riding in big crowds, but I like to be with a couple of people.
So that answer I obviously changes if it's in a familiar place.
Yeah, if it's a familiar place, I'm not as necessarily as desirous of being with someone else. I might want to just be on my own. Yeah.
Wow, okay. That's an amazing observation to have of yourself too. I like that. Jennifer Hammelman, it has been an absolute pleasure to speak with you today. I have really enjoyed learning more about Adventure Cycling Association as a podcast host who's interviewed many guests who've taken trips on the routes that you probably have helped to create. It's a great way to circle back to that, isn't it? And
Mm-hmm.
for me to learn more about the information that's out there. But I also loved how being surrounded in that world prompted you to take that journey. And I can hear how it has been an overwhelmingly positive experience for you as well. It
Yes.
has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so, so much for sharing your story and experiences here on Seek Travel Ride.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me and for your curiosity. It really was exciting to revisit some of those things and be able to share them with you and your audience. It's been a pleasure for me as well. Thank you, Bella.
I really enjoyed my time there chatting with Jen, learning about the Adventure Cycling Association and speaking to the person that's been responsible for setting down some of these routes that so many thousands of bicycle travellers would have taken to have their own amazing adventures. I love that serendipitous moment that Jen has had herself of taking her own adventures on some of those routes herself and just finding exactly what it's like to take a long distance bicycle tour too. If you're enjoying Seek Travel Ride, definitely get onto the Facebook page and join our Seek Travel Ride community. I've got a link in the show notes there. You'll join a big growing community of fans of the show and some guests of the show too. We go into a bit further detail on every episode and chat about some of the topics that came up there as well. Lastly, make sure you're following the show in your podcast player. That way you get notified when new episodes drop. They are releasing each and every week. And if you're new to the show, be sure to check out the back catalogue. If these are the sort of stories that you like listening to, I can tell you now there are so many out there for you to filter through and find, whether it's travels along the US, through a country, through Europe, around the world, bikepacking races, adventurers, or long-distance cycle tours. There is a guest that has done something that you are probably interested in. And hearing about the human interest side of their stories, not just about the bicycle part of their trip, I think it's what sparks the most interest in our listeners as well. Until the next episode, my name's Bella Malloy. Thanks for listening.